Thank you for joining me. The heart of what I want to do here is to look at three poems by Polish poets. Two of the poets are Jewish, one is not. One of the poems is in Yiddish, two of them are in Polish. And when we get to the poems, I'll read most of them to you in English, but I'll also do a little reading here and there in Yiddish and Polish. I have pretty limited skills in both of those languages, but we'll make it work. So we'll get to the poems in a few minutes, but I want to start with a little backstory. To begin with, my wife Sheila and I went to Poland 2 years ago. We were there for a week or so for the annual International Conference on Jewish Genealogy. And we try to go to that conference every year. It's held every summer. Once a year, it's held in a different city around the world. Usually the cities are here in the United States, but sometimes they're abroad. We've been to this conference in Paris and Jerusalem, and 2 years ago in Warsaw. So we had some negative feelings about going to Poland. You know, it's hard to shake the bonds of history. And whether or not we should go is a particularly hard decision for Sheila. She lost a good part of her family in the Holocaust. Her mother's entire family was from Poland, and mother's entire family was lost. But in the end, we decided to go. We figured we wouldn't be there for that long. And in any case, we'd be surrounded by Jewish friends that we'd made over many years attending these conferences. You see a lot of the same people are repeat customers every summer. So here's a little history, and since I'm a mathematician, this will be from the perspective of numbers. I read some statistics on Polish demographics during and before the war, and it said that of the 35 million people who lived in Poland, Poles, before the war, 3 million of them, 3 million Jews and 3 million non-Jews were killed during the war. Also that about, and these are very approximate numbers, about 1 million Poles actively worked against Jews in a greater or lesser way during the war. Greater way meaning things like turning a family into the Gestapo, working in a concentration camp. Lesser way, denying someone some food, turning your back on someone when they need your help. And about 1 million Poles actively helped Jews in a greater or lesser way. And of course, no doubt you're aware that the greater way means that there were Poles who hid Jewish families at the risk of their own lives and the lives of their own families. So you think about, you think about all the other millions. What was going on with them? Well, we all probably have our own favorite conventional wisdom about that we've latched onto. But let me tell you a little story that relates to that. There's a photograph we saw in a museum in Warsaw. It showed Poles in Warsaw out on the street going about their business. This is during the war. They're going shopping, they're walking with their kids and so forth. And they're dressed kind of in the way I remember my parents dressing when I was a little kid in the late 40s and early 50s. I always remember my father with one of these felt fedora hats, and you saw a lot of those hats in this picture. Also in the picture, on one side of the street, is a ghetto wall. I don't know if this was the Warsaw Ghetto or what city this was in, but it's a ghetto wall, and you could see smoke rising above the wall. The description underneath the picture says that had you been there, you also would have heard screams and gunfire. But these folks just seem to be going about their business. On the other hand, every few feet, you see armed guards standing against the wall. So really, what were these people supposed to do? Now, I don't say this by way of defending the 20 odd million people who did nothing, but it's just to say, this is complicated. Here are a couple of more numbers. In Poland today, there are something like 10 to 15,000 people, thousand, who identify as being Jewish. There may be many more who keep it under wraps or don't even know that they're Jewish. I mentioned that 3 million Jews were murdered in the war, during the war. And you probably know that before the war there were something just under 3.5 million Jews in Poland. It's also true that in Poland today, anti-Semitism is, it's not insignificant. Of course, it seems it's not so insignificant here either, or in lots of other countries. It's also true that ignorance about Jews and Poland's Jewish history, that's also not insignificant. But what Sheila and I found in Warsaw were people, some of whom were Jews, most of them were non-Jews, people who were pushing back against all this. For example, there's an organization of non-Jews that travels around to small towns in the countryside and educates the young people about the Jewish presence that their towns used to have, about how sometimes, in some cases, their town actually was mostly Jewish, and why it isn't today. And for the most part, according to what this group reported to us, they encounter young people who want to learn about these things and who are not afraid to face these things. Now, in this same vein, there was a documentary Sheila and I saw about 5 years ago. This was some years before we went to Poland or even thought about going there. It's a documentary we saw that it's called The Return. And it's about 4 young Polish women who discover that they are Jewish. Their grandparents or parents had hidden their Jewish identities during the war. And all of these young 20-something women were excited and happy when they made this discovery. Now, when one of the women was asked by the filmmaker, "Why is that? Why are you so happy?" She said, "Well, if you're a young person in Poland today, living in a city, and you want to be cool, then you got to have a friend who is gay or black or Jewish. But if you want to be really cool, you need to be one of those 3 things yourself. And what do you know? It turns out I'm one of those things." And I remember thinking when I saw this that, well, that's very nice, but I'm sure it only applies to a pretty small minority of people. But now that I've traveled to Poland, though I think it may indeed be a minority that kind of attitude applies to, still this group of people, small though they may be, they are not insignificant. Maybe they are in numbers, but people who think like these 4 women, or who act like the people I mentioned in that organization that travels around educating kids, their very presence brightens the landscape far beyond their numbers. It makes you think of the last verse, this is famous lines, the last verse of the W.H. Auden poem, September 1st, 1939, a poem about the onset of World War II. The war started when Germany invaded Poland. Since we're going to be talking about poems in a minute, let's kind of get our poetic feet wet, and I'll read you the last verse of that Auden poem. Defenseless under the night, our world in stupor lies, yet dotted everywhere, ironic points of light flash out wherever the just exchange their messages. May I, composed like them of eros and of dust, be leaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame. What all this means for me personally is that I would certainly go back to Poland. I don't know if we will, but I hope we have a chance to. All right, let's talk about poetry. All three of the poems I'm going to read were originally much longer. I abridged them for our purposes here. Now, normally you can't abridge a poem. You can't do that. But I gave it a shot. And you know what? It seemed to work out with these. I hope I'm not kidding myself. But I think it worked out. Nonetheless, it will help if I preface each of these poems with some words to try to make up for the missing passages, to give you some context. So the first poem is entitled In a Ghetto, and it was originally written in Yiddish. It's by the poet Yankov Glatstein. Yankov Glatstein was born in Poland. He emigrated with his family to the United States when he was a teenager, and that was sometime in the 1920s. He lived the rest of his life in New York, but he had a poet's keen insight and sensitivity. So, though he himself was never in a ghetto, this poem of his about life in a ghetto really rings true. Now, in this small part of it, I'm going to read a father and a son are looking through a fence or an opening in the ghetto wall, and they see the non-Jewish population out there. Kids are playing, people are going to church or to school. Think of it as perhaps something like the photograph I described earlier. And the father tells the son, those people out there, they may look like real people, but they're not. They have the heart of a skeleton. Now, let me read this poem. I'll share the screen with you. And you see here the poem in Yiddish on the right and in English on the left. You know, I'm going to read it. I'll actually read it in Yiddish. I think you can follow along, certainly, if you know Yiddish, but I think that even if you don't know Yiddish, if you try to follow along in English, I think you'll be able to do that. Yiddish and English are both Germanic languages, and I think a lot of the kind of rhythm and feel of the words is similar in the two languages. Well, we'll see. We'll give it a try. So this is In a Ghetto by Yankov Glatstein. Sei abgehiet, die Verwüstung ruft wieder. A wilder Acker zermuscht, a Größe set und gefindt das Herz von a Skelett. Und Tonner sollst du dir einreden, als a Skelett is on a Herz. Sollst du wissen, krank Jüngel, das ganze zergliederte, zündende Leben auf jener Zeitparken kann dich nicht stärken, erheben, weil sie's Skeleton Herz mit der ganzen Freude, Rachmanis und Glocken von Gläuben. Okay, we're back. A few words about the poem. This skeleton heart image reminds me of a scene in the book The Tin Drum by Günter Grass. You may have read that. It's a great novel. It's a great anti-war book. And the scene I'm talking about in that book takes place just after the war in Berlin. There's a nightclub called the Onion Cellar, and every table in there has a plate. There's a plate on the table with a cut up onion on it. And what that's used for is that when a performer gets up and performs a sad song and you in the audience, you're supposed to cry, what you do is you take the plate and hold it close to your face so that your eyes will tear up. That's what these skeleton heart Germans have to do to simulate crying. Now, the next poem we'll get to here is by the poet Władysław Szlangel, who was also Jewish, but whose native language was Polish, not Yiddish. Maybe he didn't even know Yiddish. So a little sidebar about that. So last year I had a conversation with a language professor at Mount Holyoke about the Polish Jews whose native language was Polish and not Yiddish. I wanted to know about how many Jews he thought that applied to before the war. He said it's hard to get numbers on something like that, but he thought there was a reasonable fraction of Polish Jews who not only spoke Polish, but probably didn't even know Yiddish. They might tend to be less religious than others, probably more urban, more assimilated. What had particularly sparked my interest in this question was that among those Polish-speaking Jews were Sheila's mother's family. Sheila's mother had four older siblings. They were all married, they all had kids, and they all only spoke Polish. And they were all killed in the Holocaust, as I mentioned. Sheila's mother alone came to the United States. That was in the 1920s, which is where she learned Yiddish, possibly from Sheila's father. When she met him, he was from Latvia and he was a native Yiddish speaker. While we're talking about this, here's a similar story, but in reverse. So my grandmother and her family were also from Poland, and they spoke Yiddish. Maybe they knew a few words of Polish to get by. But when they came to the United States, they lived in a coal mining town in Pennsylvania. Well, that's where my mother grew up. And in that town, many of their neighbors were miners, and those miners were Polish immigrants. And the result of that was that over the years, my grandmother's Polish improved dramatically, but her English never got to be very good. This is even though she came over here as a teenager, pretty young. Here's another thing of interest, as long as I'm talking about my grandmother. There's a woman that we know named Myrna, whose grandmother also came from the same shtetl as my grandmother. And this woman, Myrna, became part of a project to restore the Jewish cemetery in that shtetl. The shtetl is the town of Gonions. It's outside of Białystok. And this is a typical story. The cemetery is overgrown with broken and overturned headstones. This is a common thing all over Europe. And it's also common all over Europe that there are, of course, no Jews in these towns where you find these neglected cemeteries. Well, Myrna went over there and she talked to the town dignitaries and told them she was raising money for this project. She described the project. And a group of local high school kids came forward and said, "We'll help you out. We'll help clean up the cemetery for nothing." And they did. You know, another example of people who are pushing back against the bad stuff. One more comment about the Polish language before we finally get to this poem. And when Sheila and I decided to go to Poland, we made that decision maybe a year and a half before the conference. So I decided to use that time to try to learn some Polish. I figured, well, I'll have a more meaningful experience there if people see that I've made an effort to learn at least a little bit of their language. And maybe a little more of their language than just saying hello and thank you. And I have to tell you, this is one hard language. If you're kind of looking around at random, looking for a language to learn, save yourself, unless you have some special interest. This language will bring you to your knees. It's harder by far than any other language I've ever studied. And just pronouncing some of those words, sometimes you feel like you're gargling with razor blades. I sometimes wonder how these people even talk to each other. Thing is, though, once you get into it, once you get over an initial hump where like every day you kind of feel like, well, like I just described, you start to see that Polish is actually a beautiful language. It's hard, but it's beautiful. I was talking to a Polish friend at work. I've sometimes tried out a phrase or two on him to his great amusement. And I told him that I thought Polish was a beautiful language. And he said, well, it's an interesting language, but come on, even I don't think it's beautiful. French is beautiful. And I said, no, Polish is beautiful too, but in a different way. French is like it's like a stream winding uninterrupted through a beautiful meadow. Polish is like that too, only there are occasional sharp rocks sticking up in the stream and the water has to flow around them. And that's beautiful as well. All right, well, let's get to the poem. This poem is also about a ghetto, specifically about the Warsaw Ghetto. And in this case, it's by someone who was there and died there. When in the Warsaw Ghetto, when people were herded into apartments, there were multiple families per apartment. So what they would do is they put notes outside near the doorbell saying how many times to ring the doorbell, depending on which family you were there to see. And then when those families were taken out to be shipped off to a concentration camp, new families would be crammed in there. And if they thought of it, a new piece of paper would be taped up. And it's that experience that this poem is about, or I should say, that's the nominal focus of this poem. So again, I'll share the screen so you can read along. So the poem is called Doorbells by Władysław Szlangel. A piece of paper was hanging on the door. It could be read only from up close. The bell works, please ring, and 3 names. For Mrs. L, 1 time. For Mr. K, 2 times. For the doctor, 3 times. The piece of paper, please ring, still hangs on the door. But the door is open. There are no doorknobs. Torn out when they found them locked, the doors are wide open. On the door, the piece of paper with the names and please ring. For Mrs. L, 1 time. For Mr. K, 2 times. For the doctor, 3 times. New inhabitants came and cleaned it up, put in new doorknobs. Didn't take the piece of paper from the door. They forgot. Dusk will come, the gray time of day. Evening is closer and closer. Darkness grows from the corners, chasing something from the rooms. I know. Let them ring the bell 1 or 2 or 3 times. Shadows move on the walls, phantoms or vapors. It's for me, it's for me. Smothered whispers float in the air, dry and dead lips. 1 time, oh, that's for me. Maybe my son is coming to see me. Now again, twice. These are the neighbors coming to me. In a hallway without lights, phantom lodgers. Now they ring 3 times. Oh, it's for me, a sick person. A silent tugging at the doorknob next to the wall. A sigh and distress that the hand is helpless, that it isn't easy for ghosts to turn on the light in the hallway, to open the door, to welcome. Oh, it's you. What's new? The doorbell rings. You go. You always stumble against something. You open the door. No one. It's for them. Because on the door, the paper is still there. Ring for Mrs. L once, for Mr. K twice, for the doctor 3 times. Władysław Szlangel wrote this poem in Polish, and out of respect to him, I'd like to read at least part of it in Polish. So it's these lines that you see on the bottom here. These lines correspond to the last few lines in English. If you look at the English and read up 8 lines where it says you open the door, no one. So starting with you open the door till the end, that's what the Polish corresponds to. Otwierasz drzwi, nikogo, to do nich. Bo na drzwiach wciąż kartka, dzwonić do pani L raz, do pana K 2, a do doktora 3 razy. I'll bring you back now. Okay. This last poem, which is also in Polish, is by the poet Wisława Szymborska. She was not Jewish. She was a famous poet. She won the Nobel Prize in the 1990s, and she died about 10 years ago. Like the other 2 poems, this one is ultimately about death. In fact, this one is explicitly about death. But despite that, it is strangely uplifting. This poem suggests to me a sort of parable, which is actually less about death than about time. And I'm going to tell you that parable first, and then I'll read the poem. I suppose the parable, think of it as a kind of improvisation on the theme of the poem. It'll also provide you with some context for what I left out when I abridged the poem. So here's the parable. I want you to imagine time as a kind of fabric or tapestry. It stretches backward into the lost mists of prehistory, and it stretches forward into some unknown infinite future, infinitely into the past and infinitely into the future. But the thing is, the whole tapestry in its entirety is always present. Now, I want you to imagine the moments of your life when you are your best self. I think nowadays people like to say your most authentic self. I don't like that expression. So when you are your best self, let's call it that. So times, in other words, let's say when you help an old person across the street, when you visit with a sick friend, when you tell the truth, even when that's a hard thing to do. Every time you have one of those moments, imagine that a badge gets pinned up there on the tapestry of time in a place that marks the time and place of your special moment. And once it's there for good, for all time, and nothing can change that. Now, at some point, death will come calling for you, as it does for everyone. Death would like nothing better than to obliterate you altogether, as if you had never existed. But when death tries to turn the special doorknob that will accomplish that obliteration, it's in vain. It's like the spirits in the last poem who are unable to open the door. Here too, in this case too, the door won't open because your badges of honor are pinned up there on that tapestry. They're there already and nothing can take them down. It's too late for death to obliterate you. Okay, that's my parable. And now here is the poem. So I'll share the screen again. So the poem is On Death Without Exaggeration by Wisława Szymborska. It can't take a joke, find a star, make a bridge. It knows nothing about weaving, mining, farming, building ships, or baking cakes. In our planning for tomorrow, it has the final word, which is always beside the point. It can't even get the things done that are part of its trade: dig a grave, make a coffin, clean up after itself. Preoccupied with killing, it does the job awkwardly, without system or skill, as though each of us were its first kill. Whoever claims that it's omnipotent is himself living proof that it's not. There's no life that couldn't be immortal, if only for a moment. Death always arrives by that very moment, too late. In vain, it tugs at the knob of the invisible door. As far as you've come, can't be undone. Now, out of respect for Wisława Szymborska, I'll read the last few lines of this poem as well in Polish. If you look in the English and read up 6 lines from the bottom, you see the line, there's no life that couldn't be immortal, and so on. So it's from that point down to the end that corresponds to this Polish. Nie ma takiego życia, które by choć przez chwilę nie było nieśmiertelne. Śmierć zawsze o tę chwilę przybywa spóźniona. Na próżno szarpie klamką niewidzialnych drzwi, kto ile zdążył, tego mu cofnąć nie może. I have to say that for me personally, with this poem, Wisława Szymborska has changed my view of death. I think there's just something healthy in her humor and the way she puts death in its place. Now, let me just finish up with a general comment about the poetry aspect of these poems. Now, you know from studying poetry in school, high school or college, there are lots of ways of looking at literature and poetry, lots of theories out there, political theories, psychological theories, and so on. But one simple way to think about a poem is to think of it as being made up of 2 elements, sound and sense. Sound meaning the music of the poetry, rhyme and well-placed alliteration, the rhythm of the lines, and so forth. And sense referring to the meaning of the words. Now, there are poets whose poems seem to rely more on one of these elements than the other. For instance, I think of Tennyson or Dylan Thomas, whose poems seem to rely more on sound than sense. Sure, both elements are there, but there seems to be more of a slant in a way towards sound, at least the way I read these poems, these poets. Poets whose, for me at least, whose poems appear to rely more on sense are, well, for example, Walt Whitman and Wallace Stevens. And again, sure, there's sound, there's music there as well, but I think the bias kind of goes the other way. Now, the 3 poems we just read, I think they also rely more on sense than they do on the music of the words. And maybe that's just because these particular meanings of oppression and genocide and death, these meanings carry so much weight that the poets, it's almost like they had no choice but to craft the poems the way they did, with reliance on the meaning of the words. And so, thank you for listening. I think I've gone on long enough here. Sei gesund and do widzenia.